A dust cloud billowed across the horizon as Faith Zimmerman clutched her wide-brimmed hat against the relentless prairie wind, her heart racing with determination despite the ominous skies gathering overhead. Nebraska Territory, 1867, not the place she'd imagined starting a new life. But after her father's passing had left her with nothing but debts, and a letter from her mother's cousin offering a teaching position in the newly established town of Cottonwood Springs, she had little choice. The stagecoach had dropped her 3 miles from her destination, the driver apologizing profusely but refusing to risk his horses on what he called that devil's patch of prairie, with a storm brewing. Faith understood his caution. The darkening sky promised a downpour, but her trunk was heavy, her boots already rubbing blisters on her ankles, and her city upbringing hadn't prepared her for navigating the vast emptiness of the frontier. "Just follow the trail," the driver had said, pointing toward a barely visible path winding through the tall grass. "You'll see the church steeple when you get close." Faith adjusted her grip on her trunk handle and squinted against the horizon. No steeple, no buildings. Nothing but grass rippling like an ocean all around her, punctuated by occasional wildflowers whose names she didn't know. A distant rumble of thunder made her quicken her pace. The wooden handle of her trunk dug into her palm and she shifted it to her other hand, pausing to catch her breath. 22 years old, and she'd never felt so alone, so exposed to the elements. Back in Philadelphia, there had always been buildings, people, the comforting confinement of civilization. Here there was only the vast sky and endless land. Something caught her eye, a strange depression in the ground ahead, like a shallow bowl in the prairie. The grass looked different there, greener perhaps. Faith stepped toward it, curious despite her hurry. The ground seemed to give slightly beneath her feet as she approached. Then it happened, a sickening lurch as the earth beneath her suddenly wasn't there anymore. Faith screamed as she plunged downward, her trunk flying from her grasp. Her descent was chaotic, a mixture of falling dirt, tangled roots, and her own flailing limbs. She landed hard on something that wasn't quite solid ground but softer than rock, knocking the breath from her lungs. For several moments, Faith lay still, afraid to move, afraid she'd broken something vital. Gradually, she tested her limbs. Nothing seemed broken, though everything hurt. Looking up, she saw a circle of gray sky perhaps 15 feet above her. The walls of her prison were dirt and rock, with roots protruding like gnarled fingers. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing slightly. "Can anyone hear me? Help!" Only the distant thunder answered. Faith pushed herself to a sitting position and assessed her situation. The hole, a sinkhole, she realized was roughly circular, perhaps 10 feet across. The sides were steep, some nearly vertical. Her trunk had landed nearby, its contents now scattered across the uneven floor of the pit. She'd fallen into some sort of underground cavity that had been hidden beneath the prairie grass. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as she realized how precarious her situation was. No one knew she was here. The stagecoach had continued on its route. Her cousin in Cottonwood Springs wasn't expecting her until tomorrow. She could die here, alone in this hole, and no one would find her for days, perhaps weeks. Faith forced herself to breathe slowly. Panicking wouldn't help. She needed to find a way out. Standing carefully, she approached the wall of the pit, searching for handholds. The dirt crumbled under her fingers. Each attempt to climb only brought down more soil. After several frustrating efforts that left her hands scraped and her dress filthy, she sank back down. The first drops of rain splashed into the hole, landing on her upturned face. Perfect. If the rain continued, the sinkhole might fill with water. The thought sent a new wave of terror through her. "Hello," she called again, louder this time, desperation edging her voice. "Please. Is anyone out there?" To her astonishment, a face appeared at the edge of the hole, a man's face, tanned and weathered beneath the brim of a cowboy hat. "Well now," a deep voice drawled, "you found yourself a mighty inconvenient resting spot, madam." Relief made Faith's eyes fill with tears. "Please help me, I fell in and I can't climb out." The face disappeared for a moment, then returned. "Hold steady, I'm coming down to get you." Before Faith could protest that he should find rope instead of risking himself, The man had swung his legs over the edge and was carefully making his way down, finding footholds where she had seen none. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, his movements deliberate and sure. As he descended, Faith got a better look at him. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a dusty blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. His jeans were worn at the knees, and his boots had seen many miles. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with keen eyes that assessed the situation even as he climbed. He reached the bottom of the pit and turned to face her, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair. "Ethan Valero," he said, extending a hand. "Ranch foreman at the Triple Creek." "Faith Zimmerman," she replied, taking his offered hand. His palm was calloused, his grip firm. "I was on my way to Cottonwood Springs when the stagecoach driver left me on the trail." "Mason left you out here with a storm coming." Ethan's expression darkened. "That doesn't sound like him." "He said something about not risking his horses on that devil's patch of prairie," Faith explained. Understanding dawned on Ethan's face. "Ah. You're on the edge of what locals call sinking ground. There are underground water channels that create cavities. We've lost cattle here before, but never a person." He looked up at the opening. "The rain's picking up. We need to get you out of here before this hole gets any bigger." As if to emphasize his point, a section of the wall crumbled, sending a shower of dirt into the pit. Faith instinctively stepped closer to Ethan, her shoulder brushing his. "I don't see how we'll get out," she said quietly. "I tried climbing, but there aren't any stable handholds." Ethan surveyed the walls. "There's a technique to it, but first." He removed his bandana and offered it to her. "Tie back your hair, it'll make things easier." Faith accepted it with murmured thanks, gathering her chestnut locks and securing them as best she could. Meanwhile, Ethan moved to her trunk and quickly assessed its contents. "We can't take this with us," he said. "I'll send someone back for it once you're safe." "But my belongings will be wet but recoverable," he finished firmly. "Your safety comes first." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a natural authority that Faith found herself responding to despite her usual independence. She nodded. Ethan approached her again, his expression serious. "I need to get you out of here first, then I'll follow. I'll have to help boost you up to where the handholds are better." Before Faith could fully process what he meant, Ethan had moved behind her, placing his hands at her waist. "Ready?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Yes," she managed, suddenly acutely aware of his proximity. With surprising strength, Ethan lifted her toward a section of the wall where roots created natural handholds. "Grab those roots and pull yourself up," he instructed. "I'll support you from below." Faith did as he directed, her fingers finding purchase among the tangled roots. She pulled herself upward, feeling Ethan's hands move from her waist to support her feet, giving her additional leverage. Inch by inch, she ascended the wall of the pit, her muscles straining with effort. "You're doing well," Ethan encouraged from below. "Keep going." The rain was falling steadily now, making the dirt slippery and the roots slick. Faith's dress, already dirty from the fall, became heavy with mud. Still, she persisted, finding new handholds, pulling herself ever upward. She was perhaps halfway up when it happened the root she was gripping tore free from the wall. Faith screamed as she began to fall backward, certain she would crash down onto Ethan and possibly injure them both. Instead, she felt his arms wrap around her from behind, catching her against his chest. For a breathless moment, they stood pressed together, her back against his front, his arms encircling her protectively. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice low and reassuring. "I won't let you fall." Faith's heart hammered against her ribs, and she wasn't sure if it was from the near fall or from the unexpected intimacy of their position. She became aware of the strength in his arms, the solid warmth of his chest against her back. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible over the rain. Ethan held her a moment longer than strictly necessary before carefully setting her back on her feet. When Faith turned to face him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We need a different approach," he said, all business again. "The rain's making the walls too unstable." He glanced around the pit, then back at her. "I have a rope on my horse. If I can get out, I can pull you up." How will you get out without help? Faith asked. A slight smile curved his lips. I've been climbing things I shouldn't since I was old enough to walk. My mother called me a mountain goat. He studied the walls again. There's a route I can take. It's risky, but with the rain getting worse, it's our best option. Faith watched as Ethan moved to a different section of the wall and began his ascent. He climbed with the grace of someone who understood the land intimately, testing each handhold before committing his weight, finding places to brace his boots that Faith's untrained eye would have missed. Halfway up, he paused to catch his breath, looking down at her with a reassuring smile. When we get out of here, he called down, I'll introduce you to my horse, Samson, finest animal in the territory. I look forward to it, Faith replied, touched by his attempt to keep her spirits up. Ethan continued his climb, his movements more cautious as he neared the top where the soil was loosest. Faith held her breath as he reached for the edge, praying it would hold his weight. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed the rim would crumble beneath his hands, but then he heaved himself upward and over, disappearing from view. Faith waited anxiously, staring at the circle of gray sky above. Had he made it safely? Would he return with the rope, or had he decided the risk was too great? The rational part of her mind knew these fears were unfounded. He'd given no indication he would abandon her, but isolation and fear made logic difficult to maintain. Just as her anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, Ethan's face reappeared at the edge of the pit. I'm going to lower the rope, he called down. Tie it around your waist and I'll pull you up. The end of a lasso snaked down into the hole. Faith caught it and looped it around her waist as instructed, tying it securely. Ready, she called up. Hold tight to the rope and use your feet against the wall, Ethan directed. I'll do most of the work, but you'll need to help. As Ethan began to pull, Faith felt herself lifted off the ground. She braced her feet against the wall as he'd instructed, walking upward as he pulled. The process was arduous. Her wet skirts kept tangling around her legs, and several times her feet slipped on the muddy wall, but inch by inch, she ascended toward safety. When she neared the top, Ethan reached down and grasped her arm, pulling her the final distance until she spilled onto the prairie beside him. For a moment, Faith lay on the wet grass, rain pelting her face, too relieved to move. Then Ethan was kneeling beside her, concern evident in his expression. Are you all right? He asked, helping her to a sitting position. Faith nodded, attempting to brush mud from her ruined dress. Thanks to you, she said, meeting his gaze. You saved my life, Mr. Valero. Ethan, he corrected, a smile warming his features. And I'd say it was fortunate I was passing by Miss Zimmerman. Faith, she returned his smile. And was it fortunate, or were you looking for sinkholes to rescue damsels from? A laugh escaped him, rich and genuine. Can't say that was my plan for the day. I was heading back to the ranch when I saw what looked like a trunk sitting all alone on the prairie. Thought that was mighty strange, so I came to investigate. Remembering her belongings, Faith glanced back at the sinkhole. My things will have to wait, Ethan finished, looking at the sky. This storm's getting worse and we need to find shelter. He stood and offered his hand. My horse is tethered just beyond that rise. Cottonwood Springs is still a fair distance, but there's a line shack about a mile from here where we can wait out the worst of it. Faith accepted his hand and rose to her feet, wincing at the various aches making themselves known. Ethan's brow furrowed with concern. Are you injured? He asked, his gaze sweeping over her. Just bruised, I think, Faith assured him. Nothing serious. Ethan didn't look convinced but nodded. Let's get to Samson. I'd offer you my coat, but it would just be another wet layer at this point. They walked side by side through the rain-soaked grass. Faith was acutely aware of Ethan's presence beside her, the way he shortened his stride to match hers, how he steadied her with a gentle hand when she stumbled on the uneven ground. By the time they reached his horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding waiting patiently in the rain, Faith felt a strange sort of trust had formed between them. Ethan patted Samson's neck affectionately before turning to Faith. Have you ridden before? In the city parks occasionally, she admitted. Nothing like this. Samson's gentle as they come, Ethan assured her. I'll ride behind you and handle the reins. Before Faith could respond, he'd clasped her waist and lifted her onto the saddle as effortlessly as if she weighed nothing. Then he swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around her for the reins. "Hold onto the saddle horn," he instructed, his voice close to her ear, "and lean back against me if you need to." As Samson began to move, Faith found herself doing exactly that, leaning into Ethan's solid presence. There was something profoundly comforting about being enveloped by his strength, protected from the elements by the simple fact of his presence. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds being the steady drumming of the rain and Samson's hoofbeats on the wet earth. Eventually, Ethan spoke. "What brings you to Cottonwood Springs, Faith? It's not exactly a destination for young ladies from the city." Faith explained about her father's death, the debts, and her cousin's offer of a teaching position. "I've never taught before," she confessed, "but I've always loved learning, and it seemed like a chance to make a new start." "The children will be lucky to have you," Ethan said, his sincerity evident even without seeing his face. "Schooling's hard to come by out here. Most kids learn just enough reading and figures to get by, then go back to working the family farm or ranch. And what about you?" Faith asked, curious about this man who had so suddenly entered her life. "Have you always been a ranch foreman?" Ethan chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her back. "No, madam. I started as a drover, moving cattle up from Texas after the war. Did that for 3 years before Mr. Harrison at the Triple Creek offered me a permanent position. Been there 2 years now." "Do you enjoy it?" "Most days," he said thoughtfully. "It's hard work, but honest. The land's beautiful, even when it's trying to kill you with drought or blizzards or sinkholes." There was a smile in his voice as he added, "And occasionally it provides unexpected pleasures like rescuing pretty schoolteachers." Faith was glad he couldn't see the blush that warmed her cheeks. Before she could formulate a response, Ethan pointed ahead. "There's the line shack. Not much to look at, but it's dry inside." The structure that came into view was indeed humble, a small, squat cabin made of rough-hewn logs with a single window and door. But to Faith's rain-soaked, exhausted body, it looked like salvation. Ethan dismounted first, then reached up to help Faith down. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. Ethan's hands lingered at her waist, steadying her. "Careful now," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers. For a heartbeat, they stood close, the rain falling around them, and Faith felt something shift between them, a recognition of sorts, an awareness that transcended their brief acquaintance. Then Ethan released her and turned to secure Samson under the small lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. "Let's get you inside and dried off," he said, leading her to the door. The interior of the line shack was spare but neat. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a narrow cot against the far wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the single room, and shelves held basic provisions, canned goods, coffee, flour, and the like. "It's not much," Ethan said, watching Faith take in their shelter, "but it keeps the elements out." "It's perfect," Faith replied sincerely. She was so cold that her teeth had begun to chatter. Ethan immediately moved to the stove. "First things first, we need to get warm." He knelt and began arranging kindling and wood from a stack beside the stove. "There are some blankets in that trunk," he nodded toward a wooden chest, "and a spare shirt that might be drier than what you're wearing." Faith moved to the trunk and found the blankets and the shirt he'd mentioned, a faded blue flannel that looked wonderfully dry compared to her sodden attire. She glanced back at Ethan, who was focused on lighting the fire. "I'll turn my back so you can change," he said without looking up, as if reading her thoughts. "You'll catch your death in those wet clothes." Once the fire was started, true to his word, Ethan turned to face the wall. Faith quickly stripped off her ruined dress and petticoats, using one of the blankets to dry herself as best she could before pulling on the flannel shirt. It fell to mid-thigh on her, the sleeves extending well past her hands until she rolled them up. "I'm decent," she announced, and Ethan turned back around. Something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance, but he quickly masked it. "You should wrap up in a blanket too," he said, his voice gruffer than before. Sit by the stove while I make us something hot to drink." Faith did as he suggested, settling on the floor near the stove with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She watched as Ethan moved around the small space with practiced efficiency, filling a pot with water from a barrel in the corner and setting it to heat. "Coffee?" he asked, reaching for a tin on one of the shelves. Faith nodded gratefully. "Please." While they waited for the water to boil, Ethan removed his own wet shirt, hanging it near the stove to dry. Faith tried not to stare at his bare torso, but it was difficult to ignore the play of muscles under tanned skin as he moved about the cabin. He pulled a dry shirt from his saddlebag and donned it, leaving several buttons undone at the neck. Once the coffee was ready, Ethan poured it into 2 tin cups and handed one to Faith before settling on the floor beside her, his back against the wall of the cabin. "Thank you," Faith said, cradling the warm cup between her palms. "Not just for the coffee, but for everything." "If you hadn't found me." "But I did," Ethan interrupted gently. "No use thinking about what didn't happen." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the rain drumming on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Faith sipped her coffee, feeling warmth spreading through her limbs and a peculiar sense of contentment despite the circumstances. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Ethan said eventually. "I've never been east of the Mississippi." Faith described her life in the city, the bustling streets, the theaters and libraries, the changing seasons in Fairmount Park. As she spoke, she realized how different her world had been from his, yet how easily they conversed, as if they'd known each other far longer than mere hours. "It sounds grand," Ethan commented when she'd finished, "different from anything I've known." "And what have you known?" Faith asked, genuinely curious. "Where did you grow up?" Ethan's eyes took on a distant look. "All over, really. My father was a restless man. We started in Virginia, moved west to Kentucky, then Missouri. After my mother died when I was 12, we kept moving Arkansas, Texas, wherever work could be found." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I guess I inherited some of that restlessness. Never stayed in one place too long until the Triple Creek." "And now, do you feel settled there?" Ethan considered her question, absently running a hand through his still damp hair. "More than anywhere else," he admitted. "Mr. Harrison's been good to me, lets me run things my way mostly. But there are times I wonder if there's something more I should be doing with my life." There was vulnerability in his admission that touched Faith deeply. Here was a man who had saved her without hesitation, who projected such capability and confidence, yet harbored the same uncertainties about his path that she did about hers. "I understand that feeling," she said softly. "Coming west was terrifying, but staying in Philadelphia felt like accepting a life that was slowly suffocating me." Ethan's gaze met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, despite their different backgrounds. The moment lengthened, charged with possibilities neither of them had anticipated when the day began. A particularly loud thunderclap broke the spell, making Faith jump slightly. Ethan smiled and rose to his feet, extending a hand to help her up. "The storm's not letting up anytime soon," he said. "You should take the cot and get some rest. I'll keep the fire going." Faith accepted his hand but didn't release it once she was standing. "You've done so much for me already," she said. "I can't take your bed too." "It's not mine," Ethan clarified. "Line shacks belong to whoever needs them. And right now you need it more than I do." Their eyes held, and Faith became acutely aware of how close they were standing, her hand still clasped in his. She should step away, maintain the propriety she'd been raised to value. Instead, she found herself saying, "We could share the blankets by the fire. It's warmer here anyway." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, surprise followed by something deeper. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Faith nodded, not trusting her voice. She wasn't sure what had prompted her suggestion. Perhaps near-death experiences made conventional propriety seem less important, or perhaps there was something about this man that made her want to be closer to him. Ethan arranged the blankets near the stove, creating a makeshift pallet. They settled side by side, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth of each other's bodies. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the small window, wind howling around the corners of the cabin. "Try to sleep," Ethan murmured. "I'll wake you if the weather clears." Faith closed her eyes, expecting sleep to elude her given the extraordinary circumstances and the presence of the virtual stranger beside her. Instead, she found herself drifting off almost immediately, lulled by the sound of the rain, the warmth of the fire, and the inexplicable feeling of safety that Ethan's presence provided. She woke sometime later to find that she had shifted in her sleep, her head now resting on Ethan's shoulder. His arm had come around her, holding her against his side. For a moment, Faith remained still, absorbing the unfamiliar but pleasant sensation of being held by him. Ethan must have sensed her wakefulness, for he spoke softly, "The storm's passing, rain's letting up." Faith reluctantly lifted her head to look at him. In the soft glow of the fire, his features seemed both stronger and gentler somehow. "How long was I asleep?" she asked. "Couple of hours," he replied. "You needed it." Faith became aware that she was still pressed against his side, his arm still around her shoulders. She should move away, restore the proper distance between them. Instead, she found herself asking, "Have you ever believed in fate, Ethan?" His expression grew thoughtful. "Can't say I've given it much consideration," he admitted. "Life's always seemed more about choices and consequences than some grand design." His eyes met hers, searching. "Why do you ask?" "Because it seems impossible that of all the places I could have fallen, and all the people who could have found me, it was you," Faith said quietly. "A man who would risk himself to save a stranger, who would share his warmth and shelter without question." Ethan's arm tightened slightly around her. "Perhaps it wasn't fate," he said, his voice low. "Perhaps it was simply the right thing happening at the right time, and this," Faith whispered, gesturing to their close position. "Is this the right thing too?" Ethan studied her face for a long moment. "I believe it could be," he finally said, his honesty evident in every word. "I've known you less than a day, Faith Zimmerman, but there's something about you that feels." He paused, searching for the right word, "inevitable." The simple declaration made Faith's heart flutter. She had never believed in love at first sight, had always scoffed at the romantic notions in the novels her friends devoured. Yet here she was, feeling a connection to this man that defied rational explanation. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the diminishing rain. Ethan's free hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "May I kiss you, Faith?" he asked, the question both gallant and intense. In answer, Faith leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as Ethan pulled her closer. His kiss was like everything else about him, steady, sure, and somehow both gentle and passionate at once. When they finally parted, Faith was breathless, her heart racing. Ethan's eyes had darkened, and he looked at her with an expression that made her feel both cherished and desired. "I should take you to Cottonwood Springs," he said, though his tone suggested it was the last thing he wanted to do. "Yes," Faith agreed reluctantly. "My cousin will be worried when I don't arrive." Neither of them moved. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. "Would it be improper," Ethan finally asked, "if I called on you in town, perhaps Sunday after church?" A smile bloomed on Faith's face. "Very proper indeed, Mr. Valero," she replied, her formal address belied by the warmth in her voice. Ethan's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Well then, Miss Zimmerman, I look forward to furthering our acquaintance under more conventional circumstances." They reluctantly separated, gathering their now dry clothing and preparing to depart. As Faith donned her still bedraggled dress, she felt Ethan's eyes on her, not in an improper way, but with a tenderness that made her cheeks warm. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean, the afternoon sun breaking through scattered clouds. Ethan helped Faith mount Samson, then swung up behind her as before. This time, however, when his arms came around her to take the reins, Faith leaned back against him without hesitation. Their journey to Cottonwood Springs took just over an hour, during which they talked of everything and nothing: her plans for the school, His responsibilities at the ranch, books they had read, places they hoped to see someday. By the time the small frontier town came into view, Faith felt she had known Ethan Valero all her life. Martha Warren, Faith's cousin, was indeed worried and rushed from her house the moment they rode up, exclaiming over Faith's bedraggled appearance. When Ethan explained what had happened, Martha's concern turned to profuse gratitude. "You saved her life, Mr. Valero," Martha said, clasping his hand. "I don't know how to thank you enough." "It was my privilege, madam," Ethan replied, his eyes finding Faith's over Martha's shoulder. Faith felt a pang of reluctance as Ethan prepared to leave, promising to return the following day with her recovered trunk. "Until Sunday," he said quietly as he took his leave, the words a promise between them alone. "Until Sunday," Faith echoed, watching as he rode away, Samson's hooves kicking up small puffs of dust on the now dry road. Martha led Faith inside, chattering about how lovely the schoolhouse was and how excited the children were to have a real teacher. Faith listened and responded appropriately, but her mind kept returning to the sinkhole, to the lined shack, to Ethan's arms around her and his lips on hers. On Sunday, Ethan arrived at Martha's door precisely after church, looking so handsome in his best shirt and clean jeans that several young women cast envious glances Faith's way as he escorted her on a walk through town. They continued their courtship through the summer and into the fall, with Ethan riding into town whenever his duties at the ranch permitted. By Christmas, the entire community knew that the new schoolteacher and the Triple Creek foreman were in love. When Ethan proposed on New Year's Eve, beneath a sky brilliant with stars, not a soul in Cottonwood Springs was surprised except perhaps Faith herself, who still marveled sometimes at how a disaster had led to such happiness. They were married in the spring, with wildflowers blooming across the same prairie that had nearly claimed Faith's life. Mr. Harrison, impressed with Ethan's management of the Triple Creek, offered them a parcel of land and the opportunity to start their own small ranch as a wedding present. On the evening after their wedding, as they stood on the porch of the small cabin they now called home, Ethan wrapped his arms around Faith from behind, much as he had that first day on horseback. "Do you ever think about it?" he murmured against her ear. "How different our lives would be if you hadn't fallen into that sinkhole?" Faith turned in his embrace to face him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "Or if you hadn't been the one to find me," she added. Ethan smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Perhaps it was fate after all," he conceded. "Or perhaps," Faith said, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his, "it was simply the right thing happening at exactly the right time." Ethan's arms tightened around her as he deepened the kiss, and Faith knew with absolute certainty that whatever force had brought them together, fate, providence, or mere chance, she would be forever grateful for that fateful day when the earth had opened beneath her feet and led her into Ethan Valero's arms.